Mister, I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees. I speak for the trees have no tongues. And I'm asking you, sir, at the top of my lungs.
Whose interest is this in to have these two people bombed?
Did you? You can't chop this tree down.
Huh? Why not?
Can't you feel its pain?
It's pain.
A bomb went off at a busy Oakland intersection, and the man and woman who were hurt had planned to lead a summer of militant protest against logging practices in Northern California.
We've charged them with false arrest, illegal search and seizure, unequal protection of the law, and conspiracy to violate our First Amendment rights by discrediting us as terrorists.
You shouldn't commit illegal acts, except perhaps at night and with your parents' permission.
Who's their leader? They don't have a leader. They're all leaders. And there's thousands of them running around loose in these United States this very minute.
They'll build barricades to prevent the cops from moving through the woods, to prevent the movement of machinery through the woods.
By your powers combined, I
calculate probably caused about $1 million worth of damage recently. But they can sue me. I don't have any money. Ha!
It is 1918. The Bolshevik Revolution has just taken place amid the chaos of World War I. American labor is in turmoil, and governments across the world are engulfed in paranoia that the increasing radicalism of the populace will result in similar outcomes at home. The US government is using the 1917 Espionage Act, a law supposed to be used to prevent spying, sabotage, and mutiny in the military, to censor newspapers, publications, and people. Despite the written intentions of the work, the real goal is made bare in a speech by then-President Woodrow Wilson 2 years earlier, urging the law to be passed.
There are citizens of the United States, I blush to admit, born under other flags but welcomed under our generous nationalized laws to the full freedom and opportunity of America, who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life, who have sought to bring the authority and good name of our government into contempt, to destroy our industries wherever they thought it effective for their vindictive purposes, to strike at them, and to debase our politics to the uses of foreign intrigue. I urge you to enact such laws at the earliest possible moment, and feel that in doing so, I am urging you to do nothing less than save the honor and self-respect of the nation. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out. They are not many, but they are infinitely malignant, and the hand of our power should close over them at once. They have formed plots to destroy property. They have entered into conspiracies against the neutrality of the government. They have sought to pry into every confidential transaction of the government in order to serve interests alien to our own. It is possible to deal with these things very effectively. I need not suggest the terms in which they may be dealt with.
The expansion of the Espionage Act, and its further expansions via the 1918 Sedition Act, were proposed as being in the service of national security. In reality, they wrote a half-manufactured wave of public hysteria about communism onto the books, and were used to attack activist communities, silence legitimate nonviolent dissent, and target radicalism in America. The Sedition Act made it illegal to spread any kind of anti-government or anti-nationalist dissent. Violators faced 20 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Anarchists such as Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, trade unionists like Eugene V. Debs, and other similar radicals were all swept up in a wave of trials that saw over 2,000 accused and over 1,000 convicted. Alongside the legal end, a swarm of anti-socialist, anti-anarchist nationalist propaganda that helped sway the public against the convicted. The Second Red Scare post-World War II functioned similarly, with hysteria and propaganda prompting people to turn on their neighbors, accusing them of being communists over petty grievances and paranoia. But it was in 2005 that activist, investigative journalist, and author William Potter would be among the first to use the term Green Scare. He wrote a book entitled Green is the New Red, in the wake of a wave of prominent FBI raids, convictions, and spying against green activists in movements like Earth First, the ELF, and the ALF, and other radical pro-animal rights and pro-environment groups. Potter himself was faced with an attempt by the FBI to intimidate him into informing on the activities of his allies. He was not the only one targeted in this capacity by the FBI. Craig Rosenbrow, a spokesperson for the Earth Liberation Front who published anonymous communiques, was subpoenaed 8 times by the FBI, refusing to comply or provide information each time between 1997 and 2006. Mere proximity to the movement, much like the original Red Scare, was enough to get someone in serious legal water. This trend continues today. Last year, on August 29, 2023, the Atlanta Police Department indicted 61 people on RICO charges for their involvement in a community bail fund utilized by activists and abolitionists. Many of the indicted were already involved in previous waves of arrests, charged with domestic terrorism and conspiracy. On February 1, 2024, the Georgian Senate passed a bill to criminalize that same bail fund style of organizing by a 30-17 margin. During the previous Green Scare, the government and corporations worked together to stop the growing radical environmentalist movement. Their tactics ranged from lobbying and legislation, FBI bomb plots, and outright attempts at assassination. The COINTELPRO program was supposed to have ended in 1971, but an analysis of the history of the environmentalist movement and the Green Scare shows that it never did. It merely evolved, and the FBI walked hand in hand with corporations and private security mercenaries to make it possible. Part of these attacks included the invention of the term eco-terrorist by corporate think tanks to smear people who literally swore to never harm a fly, and to get the public to see them as terrorists. Like the old Red Scare, the hysteria whipped up by the media against these people solely existed to manufacture consent for laws that make all of us less safe and less free. Now, as new critical infrastructure laws and dangerous new legal precedents legislate away the rights of people to protest ecological violence in even the most peaceful forms, I am reminded of our past, of how we arrived here. The attacks on activist communities made prolific by the original Red and Green Scares have not subsided. Rather, we are living in a new wave of these attacks. Like the Sedition Act of 1918, new legislation is once again being abusively wielded against Americans. The murderous obsession of the state with associating these activists with terrorists has already spilled innocent blood, and the state intends for it to continue to do so. The history of this repression and its impact on what activists face now in the era of hyper-militarized policing and surveillance capitalism cannot be understated. The repression activists face now is part of a legacy of escalation against a movement that seeks only to defend life. It is incredibly important to remember the history and progression of these movements so we can understand where we are now and why, and so we can understand where we're going. With that being the intention of this project, let me tell you a story.
Which side are you on? 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 From all of ye earth first.
While the actual Green Scare wasn't declared until the early 2000s, action against eco-activists was happening as far back as the 70s. And we will see soon, it was not merely the domain of federal agents and provocateurs or corporate media using their power to paint negative images. Corporations responded to the rising ecological movement of the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, with everything from lobbying to corporate disruption, espionage, and infiltration. The entire period leading up to the Green Scare can almost be described as a Cold War between environmental groups, corporations, and the state. One of the first animal liberation actions to take place in the US was in 1977, when a group of activists called the Undersea Railroad released 2 dolphins from the University of Hawaii's Marine Laboratory in Kewalo Basin. The action was a first, but it prompted many others to follow. Globally, both radical acts of animal liberation and radical environmental actions began to take place. Before this point, most environmental actions that took place were peaceful acts of civil disobedience, but the culture began to take a turn toward direct action around this time that was felt in multiple organizations. The same year that the Kewalo Basin action took place, Paul Watson was ousted from his position as a chair on the board of Greenpeace due to his disagreements with the organization's tactics. Having grown tired of non-disruptive pacifist activism, he formed the Earth Force Society with a small core of other similarly minded activists. A year later, they bought their first vessel, the Sea Shepherd. The Sea Shepherd Conservation Society enacted hundreds of direct actions and extreme daring at sea. Their tactics have ranged from destroying or sinking drift nets, ramming other boats, scuttling whaling vessels, or simply engaging in plastic pollution and oil spill cleanups. Described as activists by some and pirates by others, they intervened in whaling, sealing, poaching, and various overfishing operations around the world, from Southeast Asia to Northern Europe. They are still active to this day, and you can volunteer to join them. In 1979, the Animal Liberation Front, an organization mainly operating in the UK, had its first attributed action in the US. Animal rights activists broke into a lab in the New York University's Medical Center and freed 5 animals. The ALF's sister organization, the Earth Liberation Front, wouldn't begin acting until 1992. The structure of the ALF and subsequent ELF existed as independent and decentralized cells known as affinity groups. Any affinity group could, and still can, claim the mantle of ALF for their actions, so long as a specific set of guidelines were followed. Those being to take all necessary precautions against harming any animal, human and non-human, to liberate animals from places of abuse, i.e. laboratories, factory farms, fur farms, etc., and place them in good homes where they may live out their natural lives free from suffering, to inflict economic damage to those who profit from the misery and exploitation of animals, to reveal the horror and atrocities committed against animals behind locked doors by performing direct actions and liberations. Any group of people who are vegetarians or vegans and who carry out actions according to these guidelines have the right to regard themselves as part of the Animal Liberation Front. This particular method of spreading ideas and actions is common among many anarchist movements and would be replicated by groups such as the pro-bodily autonomy organization Jane's Revenge, anti-racist and anti-fascist action groups, and of course the Earth Liberation Front. Members of the ALF generally had an anarchist tendency, which provided tactically the cell structure and focus on direct action. Philosophically, the anarchist focus on the abolition of all forms of hierarchy gave the ALF a unique perspective and fixation on speciesism, the term being defined by them as a prejudice or attitude of bias toward the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species.
To this liberal definition, we could add that speciesism, aside from manifesting in the dispositions of individuals, is strongly rooted in a pervasive ideological framework, reproduced by institutions such as mass media, the law, and public education, that serves to detach humanity from the enslavement of billions of animals. Indeed, many professed radicals continue to cast aside the topic of anti-speciesism, even if they're committed to fighting oppressions like racism or sexism. Yet that makes little sense, given that each of these relies on the very same logic. A particular group is morally excluded, not on the basis of their actually held capacities, but simply because they appear to be members of a different biological category. Clearly, we would reject this kind of reasoning in the case of assertions of white supremacy over non-whites. Skin color just isn't a morally relevant quality. What needs to be noticed, though, is that speciesism operates in almost exactly the same way. The only difference is that it singles out species, not race, as the relevant biological category.
The ALF's actions in the US continued to escalate with increasing frequency, strictly adhering to those guidelines. The ALF already had some notoriety at this point worldwide, having started with animal liberation actions in places like England and Belgium. Thus, it didn't take long for American capitalism to begin its response. What's interesting about this period, from the late 70s to 2001, is that much of the legwork tracking, identifying, spying on, and disrupting these activists wasn't even done by the FBI, but by corporations. Operating with carte blanche approval from the feds, a number of corporations engaged in everything from entrapment and phishing operations to spying on activists. Every piece of information they collected via private investigators and paid infiltrators was fed directly to the FBI. Often the first response to ALF or ELF actions was to submit any documents maintained on activist groups already being tracked to the FBI. Their goal wasn't just tracking and bringing down these people. The corporations pushed both in internal documents, public media, and lobbying to have the public and police consider these people domestic terrorists. Through lobbying and intense pressure on the FBI, they fought to make an organization that never killed or harmed a single person into a terrorist cell seen by the FBI as a greater threat to America than Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The FBI also actively participated in this process, which began in the years directly after the official end of the COINTELPRO program. COINTELPRO was a counterintelligence and political repression program run by the FBI from 1956 to its official termination in 1971, after being exposed by activists who broke into the FBI's offices in Media, Pennsylvania on March 8, 1971, and stole documents proving its existence.
The FBI began COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, in 1956 to disrupt the activities of the Communist Party of the United States. In the 1960s, it was expanded to include a number of other domestic groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Black Panther Party. All COINTELPRO operations were ended in 1971. Although limited in scope, about 0.2% of the FBI's workload over a 15-year period, COINTELPRO was later rightfully criticized by Congress and the American people for abridging First Amendment rights and for other reasons. FBI.
On March 8, 1971, a small team of individuals broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania and stole hundreds of documents under the cover of night. Within those documents, the group, calling themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI, found the documents that would expose what people within the New Left movements, the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement, and others already knew among themselves, that the FBI and the state were spying on them, infiltrating them, and working to destroy their movements, as well as smear them in the media and incite negative public opinions and vigilante violence. COINTELPRO included a number of tactics that will sound familiar to many of the events during the progression of the Green Scares and in times of state repression. They relied on infiltration, psychological warfare, harassment through the legal system, and criminalization, outright police violence, fostering right-wing backlash that caused stochastic violence against protesters, and strict control of the media and its portrayal of these movements. J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the FBI, used his power to control the access that radical movements had to the media, and collaborated with local police departments across the U.S. to extend the reach of COINTELPRO's repression. The difference is that these tactics post-1971 were at times not done directly by the FBI, but instead by corporations which they relied on as part of the operation in the years after exposure to help them keep up the same levels of repression and surveillance without as much risk of flack.
Dear Chief, working closely with the U.S. Department of Justice, the Fur Retailers Information Council has developed a directory of some 200 animal rights and animal welfare organizations operating in North America, which provides office addresses, names of officers and spokespersons, and a diary of incidents. We are also developing a database of enforcement information to show connections between individuals and groups involved in illegal activity. There has been an escalation of terrorist activity against furriers in recent months. Windows shot out, twice with customers in the store, paint splashed in the storefronts, bomb scares and death threats, and anti-Semitic slogans painted on windows. Thus, the Council's commitment in assisting law enforcement agencies in bringing this violence to an end. This data is available from the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. This directory is also available from our council at no charge to law enforcement agencies.
What essentially took place over the course of decades was an FBI-assisted corporate COINTELPRO operation. One particularly notable victim of this process was a woman named Fran Trutt, who was victimized by an elaborate fishing expedition conducted by a private investigating firm called Perceptions International in 1993. Perceptions International had been hired by U.S. Surgical Corporation, then owned by Leon Hirsch, to infiltrate the animal rights movement. Hirsch had found himself under the ALF's ire for the crime of using live beagles as examples of the quality of his company's staples, which they did by cutting the animals open and stapling them back together in front of a crowd. This company killed 1,000 dogs every year to accomplish this. But God forbid anything happened to that guy, I guess. Perceptions International sent one of their agents, Mary Lou Sapone, to manipulate Fran Trutt into planting a pipe bomb at Hirsch's office to kill him, in order to entrap her. Fran never intended to kill him in the first place. Perceptions International's agents gave her the plan, the means, the bomb, and drove her to the site to do it using their 2 undercover agents, who spent months pressuring the woman to commit this crime. The obvious entrapment and admissions in court from Hirsch himself that he'd hired PIs to do the job were not enough to keep her out of jail.
With evidence of his covert plans mounting, Hirsch finally acknowledged using paid informants. He told the Associated Press that animal rights terrorists had left him no choice. Many of them are very dangerous organizations, he said. They don't believe in right and wrong, as most people in society do. They believe that human beings are on the same par as rats and dogs, and they are prepared to take violent actions to enforce their beliefs. Trutt maintained that she never intended to kill Hirsch. She intended to explode the bomb as he walked into the building. It would have been purposeless to kill him, she told the Advocate of Stamford, but to scare him at this time might have effected some change. Yet the media circus and aggressive prosecution wore her down. On the New York bomb possession charges, she pled guilty and received time served in prison. On the Connecticut murder charges, she agreed to a plea agreement and then rescinded upon learning she would not be allowed to visit her dogs. Abruptly, in April 1990, she agreed to plead no contest in exchange for 1 year in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. The sex tapes, I think that's what did it. It was just disgusting, said John Williams, her attorney. I have been fearing this from the first day. How long will Fran be able to stand up to this? Prosecutors had threatened to introduce tape recordings between Trutt and Sapone, he said. On the tapes, Trutt rails against Hirsch and also discusses a sexual relationship with a woman. Even the federal prosecutor in the New York case opposed using the tapes in court. Assistant U.S. Attorney Leslie Caldwell had written a letter to a U.S. district judge questioning the handling of the case by Connecticut police. Like a sports highlight film made for the benefit of home team fans, the tape contains many of Trutt's most menacing and outrageous remarks, she wrote. However, it omits the operative's goading, encouragement, and offers of money. Bite back, making an eco-terrorist. Will Potter.
These corporations were not competent in any sense of the word during this process either. These investigations destroyed the lives of legal above-board protesters and activists, the kind of people who put flyers on doors and hand out free vegan food on campuses. They were the ones often swept up in these conspiracies. Will Potter provides his own testimony in the book Green is the New Red, explaining how he himself was targeted by federal agents and intimidated simply for flyering once and doing literally nothing else. Among the companies and groups that collaborated with the government were U.S. Surgical, the Fur Commission and National Board of Fur Farm Organizations, the American Feed Industry Association, Americans for Medical Progress, and the Foundation for Biomedical Research. Despite the burgeoning corporate spying and building tension in the years before the Mary Lou Sapone case, and similar acts of repression, ALF actions continued into the following decades. In the early 80s, they stuck mostly to raids, freeing animals and disrupting industries reliant on animal cruelty. A raid in 1979 on March 14th at the New York University Medical Center freed 5 animals. The 80s saw a massive uptick in actions, one particularly notable action being a raid on the University of Pennsylvania's head injury clinic on the 28th of May 1984. The activists did over $60,000 in damage and released tapes stolen from the lab, showing researchers laughing as they essentially tortured and maimed animals. This action led to the closure of the clinic and put an end to the studies performed there. ALF raids frequently led to the closure of labs and other businesses, either due to physical damage, damage to their reputations, loss of subjects and assets, or all three. By any measurable metric, the ALF's tactics of liberating animals, exposing cruelty, and caring for and releasing the formerly experimented on animals was an objective success. In '85, they raided UC Riverside's campus laboratory, freeing over 460 animals and causing over $700,000 in damages. This particular action became notable as one of the animals, a baby macaque, had suffered particularly cruel treatment, having his eyes sewn shut and devices implanted on his head as part of a study on blindness. The monkey was cared for by activists after the raid and made a full recovery, and the lab's projects were shut down. These raids became the norm for the ALF, and their most typical modes of action would look something along these lines. As time went on, the label of terrorist began to see more and more use by authorities and universities to describe the ALF and their actions. In '87, the ALF would commit its first alleged arson, burning 20 vehicles in a building, as well as causing over $5.1 million in damages. No one was killed, but the attack was widely condemned as terrorism. A year after the ALF began its first actions, and about 12 years before the formation of the Earth Liberation Front, Earth First formed and began its first actions. Assembling in 1980, the group was founded in the US by a core group of about 5 people: Dave Foreman, Mike Rozelle, Howie Wolk, Bart Kohler, and Ron Kazar, but now operates in 20 different countries around the world. Operating in a similar style to the ALF, Earth First relied on an affinity group cell model to function. The Earth First Journal acted as a mode of keeping these cells informed and unified on ongoing struggles, and was even able to call for environmentalists to assemble for protests and action in different areas. Like the Sea Shepherds, Earth First formed out of a dissatisfaction with the pace and direction of the environmentalist movement. Though initially they were not as radical with their actions as the Sea Shepherds or ALF, they began with normal publicity stunt-style protests. But as time went on and activists were inspired by works like Edward Abbey's The Monkey Wrench Gang, they turned toward civil disobedience and direct action. The Monkey Wrench Gang had a massive impact on the entire environmentalist movement, not just the Sea Shepherds. It, like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, provided both ideological inspiration and tactical inspiration to the movement. The book, published in 1975, is a fictional work about people using direct action and sabotage tactics to protest environmental destruction. Silent Spring, published in 1962, is a work documenting the actual real-life environmental degradation taking place at the time, and the two books together formed an ideological cornerstone for movements like Earth First. Monkey wrenching is essentially a form of direct action, the idea being to throw a wrench in the machinations of ecocidal capitalism. It is also sometimes called ecotage, a play on the word sabotage. Actions such as the destruction of clear-cutting tools and machinery in Atlanta or spiking trees are some of the more common forms of this tactic. Earth First was motivated to action by an ideology known as deep ecology. This idea was created by Norwegian philosopher Arne Naes in the 70s, who was influenced by figures such as Gandhi and Spinoza. Naes was moved to ecological radicalism, like many in this time period, after reading the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Sort of similar to some of the ideas of the ALF mentioned earlier, deep ecology seeks to counter the shallow ecology and anthropocentrism of the mainstream, which seeks to preserve nature without changing the fundamental dynamic of mankind ruling over and being separate from nature. Instead, deep ecology seeks to understand humans and our well-being as directly connected to nature. Some deep ecologists take this further and suggest the need for a decrease in the population of humans. This idea, however, is not universal among all deep ecologists, and was highly controversial for its intrinsically fascistic nature. Either way, the main focus was pointing out how ecological issues are often only addressed insofar as they harm human populations. There was a frustration with this attitude over an outlook of defending nature for its own sake and intrinsic value. The basic principles of deep ecology, as outlined by Naes and his colleague George Sessions in the work Basic Principles of Deep Ecology, are as follows. All things, human and non-human, have inherent value. Richness and diversity of life forms contribute to the realization of these values and are also values in themselves. Humans have no right to reduce this richness and diversity except to satisfy its vital needs. The flourishing of human life and cultures is compatible with a substantial decrease in human population. The flourishing of non-human life requires such a decrease. The present human interference with the non-human world is excessive, and the situation is rapidly worsening. Policies must therefore be changed. The ideological change is mainly that of appreciating life quality rather than adhering to an increasingly higher standard of living. Those who subscribe to the foregoing points have an obligation, directly or indirectly, to try and implement the necessary changes. One of Earth First's main forms of resistance during this time was engaging in tree sits, where activists would either strap themselves to trees with a rope or build tree houses in order to prevent logging. This was an incredibly impressive and intense form of protest requiring knowledge of ropes and knots that relies on high coordination between sitters and activists on the ground who provide necessary food and supplies to make staying in the trees for extended amounts of time possible.
A wooden pallet, bed base, or other type of platform is attached to a tree. A person then climbs onto the platform and typically remains there either until there is no longer a need to stay, or they are removed by force. Not all trees are suitable for supporting a sit, as it must have appropriate branches capable of bearing the weight of the platform, the sitter, and their supplies. Usually at least 2 thick and sturdy branches are needed to support the platform. However, a rigger with experience may be able to improvise and create additional supports where appropriate branches can't be found. This can sometimes be done by fully or partially suspending the platform. However, this is done less often, as a swinging platform can be unsettling for the sitter. In some cases, a platform is suspended from a single rope known as a godline. This creates an additional barrier for workers/police, as if the godline is interfered with, the platform can drop, taking the sitter with it. Sometimes the godline is attached to surrounding trees, as this prevents the attached trees from being logged or bulldozed for fear of pulling down the sit. This can be done with fastened platforms as well as suspended ones. D.A.M. the direct action movement.
The first tree sits the organization performed took place in Oregon on May 23, 1985, as they protested the logging of the Willamette National Forest by Willamette Industries. The action lasted until June 20th, when after multiple clashes with police and arrests on different occasions, the final tree sit was taken down. After this action took place, the organization found itself split in two directions, as some did not wish to continue to be associated with the increasingly radical actions of the group. Despite these tensions, those who approved continued engaging in such forms of struggle. Earth First's actions throughout the mid to late 80s and onward made them a prime target for corporate lobbyists and law enforcement. They were among the first activists to be labeled terrorists, explicitly in the media and in the halls of power. In 1988, the U.S. Congress held a hearing on the Anti-Drug Act, in which a provision was included that specifically meant to target eco-activists. This provision criminalized the use of booby traps intended to harm humans on public lands, thus both targeting illegal grows and cultivation for the drug trade and eco-activists spiking trees or engaging in other forms of direct action. The use of the Anti-Drug Act to do this served two goals: one, obscuring the actual function of the law being passed to repress the protest until it was too late, and second, to create further association between the thugs of the drug trade and eco-terrorists. Senator James McClure made many salacious claims during the meeting, alleging that terrorist thugs were driving people off public lands, their sole intention and joy being to cause harm to people and property, and claimed that they laid traps in the woods such as nails on the ground in order to harm people and animals. At this point, it had been made well known that Earth First was a non-violent organization. They had never harmed anyone, and they also didn't actually participate in tree spiking themselves. Only one case of tree spiking actually led to an injury for a man, whose name was George Alexander, in 1987, when his saw struck a metal nail as he was milling a tree. The nail caused the saw blade to break and strike Alexander in the neck and face. George Alexander worked for Louisiana Pacific, a logging company doing work at the company's Cloverdale mill, and he had complained multiple times in the past to the company about dangerous working conditions, and that the tool he was using at the time of the injury was broken and the saw blade was loose. In an interview with activist Judy Berry, Alexander and his wife talk at length about the company's lax attitude toward safety before the injury took place.
While Alexander had to file a lawsuit against the timber company to get any money for his medical expenses, Louisiana Pacific ordered a $20,000 reward for information on who spiked the tree and exploited his accident for public relations purposes across the country. Alexander stated, "They used my name all over the country, then they laid me off when the mill closed down. LP is just sorry I didn't die." Earth First activists were immediately blamed by the company and denounced as terrorists in the media for the incident. But the logging company traced the spike log to a logging project in an area where neighbors had been complaining about the logging and the threats the logging posed to their water supply. When Judy Bari received her FBI files, they included the sheriff's reports about the tree spiking incident, and she learned that the actual suspect for the spiking was a man named Bill Irvin. Irvin was a local who openly admitted to spiking trees on his own property in an attempt to dissuade Louisiana Pacific from accidentally logging trees which were not on their property.
That same year the anti-drug law was passed, NASA scientist James Hansen testified to Congress that he was 99% sure that climate change was a real, man-made catastrophe. In 1989, the FBI organized a sting operation against Earth First member Dave Foreman in Arizona. Foreman was explicitly targeted because the FBI believed his arrest would send a message and dissuade further protest. Over the course of 3 years, a $2 million infiltration operation was run by 3 FBI infiltrators, Michael A. Fain, Ron Fraser, and Catherine Clark. This was part of Thermocon, an FBI operation in response to the 1987 sabotage of a ski lift in Flagstaff, Arizona. Michael Fain, after numerous attempts, managed to convince a few activists of sabotaging a power line. Despite not participating in the action, Foreman was sentenced with a misdemeanor for handing 2 zines on eco-defense to one of the infiltrators. Foreman's arrest was only the beginning of the FBI's drive to destroy Earth First, however. On May 24, 1990, prominent Earth First organizer Judy Berry's car exploded while she was driving with her fellow organizer Derryl Cherney due to a pipe bomb placed under her seat. She and Cherney survived, but both were injured, though Cherney less severely.
I was driving my car, and I was driving down the street, and I was following somebody. At a certain point, I think she was getting ready to make a turn, and I was trying to follow her and realized I wasn't going right, and I quickly hit the brake. And at the time when I hit the brake, there was a very huge explosion, and I felt it rip through me. The explosion being so powerful that the sound itself had a force. The next thing I remember, the car was stopped, and there were people around, and I was in incredible pain that I had never felt before. I knew my back was broken. My legs both were immobile at the time. I knew that my body was ruined. I knew that I was paralyzed. I felt that I was dying.
Both were arrested and charged with transporting explosives by the Oakland Police Department and the FBI, despite the obvious evidence that this was an attempted assassination. The next day, the FBI searched Judy Barry's home and found nothing damning. During the FBI's investigation, it became apparent to them that the bomb was intended to kill Barry, and that it was a blatant attempt at assassination. Despite the FBI having clear evidence the bomb was placed under the seat of Barry's car and rigged specifically to detonate as the car was being driven, and in spite of the multiple death threats Barry had been receiving for some time before the attack from self-proclaimed workers that the FBI never bothered to look into, they insisted on pursuing the charges against her and Cherney, essentially attempting to frame them as incompetent wannabe terrorists. In the spring of 1990, several months before the bombing, Earth First activists began organizing for Redwood Summer, a campaign of protests in Northern California with the goal of preventing the logging of old-growth redwood forests. Taking inspiration from the civil rights movement, their hope was to stall the logging process out until a local proposition that would have prevented logging could be voted on and passed, while also training activists from around the country on nonviolent resistance to ecocide. During this campaign, activists faced interference from both logging workers and the corporations themselves that frequently turned violent. Louisiana Pacific and Pacific Lumber hired PR firms in order to help control the public perception of the protests, as thousands of environmentalists flooded the redwoods to participate in Redwood Summer in the lead-up to a vote on Proposition 130. These PR firms worked to smear activists in the media and in the news as eco-terrorists and stoke public fear of them. They used the story of George Alexander manipulatively, as they claimed activists would spike trees, even though at this point, Judy Barry herself had personally made agreements with the workers that activists wouldn't use those methods. There had been a clear effort to incite the workers against activists and create the impression that these protests were a threat to their jobs, as a counter to attempts by activists and workers to build inroads in common ground. On multiple occasions, fake Earth First communiques randomly appeared on work sites, encouraging tactics that Earth First did not use, and misspelling the organizers' names. The fake stories and manufactured outrage did work, however. On multiple occasions, loggers became physically violent with protesters, incited to violence by lies spread by the corporations, and acting with no interference from cops, at one point driving a truck through a protest, and on another occasion having a worker punch a woman.
I was traveling to a well-publicized demonstration as part of National Trees Week, and I had my children in my car and several of my friends, and we were rear-ended by a log truck that we had blockaded the very day before, driven by the same truck, the same driver.
Everybody's pretty badly cut and bruised. Derryl is not in the greatest of shape. They hit him attached to one of those wooden boards. They were going through Philo on their way here, and a logging truck didn't slow down coming into town, hit him from behind, propelled them into another car.
There was no squealing of brakes, there was no warning whatsoever, just simply a violent impact from the truck hitting my car. And I can only call it attempted murder.
On another occasion, a truck driver rammed one of the protesters' cars, injuring several children as well as activists. Lawsuits alleged at the time that police witnessed violence take place from the workers on multiple occasions and did nothing to intervene or help environmentalists. Despite this, Barry and the other Earth First activists still worked with willing workers to expose the company's abuses against them and form explicit agreements with them to stick to nonviolent methods.
In a December 15, 1996 interview with Eric Brazil of the San Francisco Examiner, Bari said that timber workers no longer agree with the argument that environmentalism is the main threat to their jobs. They're not stupid, she said. In Mendocino County since 1990, Louisiana Pacific laid off more than 2/3 of its workers and closed 5 of its 7 mills. What we've been saying is true. It's corporations versus the rural community. We've never said no to logging. We just want sustainable logging.
Judy was one of the main Earth First activists attempting to build class-based inroads with the workers of the mills and logging companies, and was an incredibly prominent activist and musician. The bombing attack against her was not random, but was part of a pattern of escalation marked by death threats, letters, and direct violence from police and loggers. On May 29th, Mike Janela of the Press-Democrat, a local newspaper, received a letter. It was anonymously written by someone called the Lord's Avenger, and alleged that he planted the bomb as a response to Judy's participation in pro-abortion demonstrations. Bill Staley, a Louisiana Pacific worker and Christian fanatic, was blamed for the letter, even though eventually he was dismissed as a suspect, because details in the letter about how the bomb was placed didn't add up to what actually happened. Bari and other activists around her were convinced the attack was carried out with the full knowledge and approval of the FBI. For one, Bari herself observed that the FBI arrived on the scene of the assassination attempt at the same time as typical first responders, suggesting that they had prior knowledge of the bomb, and it was later confirmed that they had been tipped off beforehand. On top of this, the FBI had just so happened to have held a bomb school in Redwood County that same year, where they staged and discussed car bombings. Frank Doyle, one of the FBI agents on Judy's case, was one of the instructors of that class, and several of the officers who responded to the bombing had been present for the class. Additionally, FBI agent Dick Held was the head of the FBI's San Francisco office at the time of the attack, and was known for his direct participation in and command of COINTELPRO operations against the Black Panthers and the American Indian Movement. It is also important to consider in this context how the FBI attempted to lie about the details of the case and charged Judy with transporting an explosive, even though they had already confirmed internally that it was a car bomb meant to kill her. They chose to keep this information quiet instead. Allegations were placed on everyone from Cherney himself to Bari's ex-husband and more, but none seemed more plausible than the allegations against the FBI. The bomb caused Judy to have to step away from organizing as she dealt with her injuries and having just been placed under arrest in the hospital, just as Earth First was preparing to begin the Redwood Summer campaign. The explosion caused severe burns as well as damage to her pelvis, multiple fractures to her tailbone, and nerve damage. She was left disabled by the attack, while Cherney survived with a few minor injuries and a ruptured eardrum. Redwood Summer was forced to continue without Judy's aid, and was rather successful. Despite thousands of attendees coming in and participating, they weren't successful in getting the legislation passed. Prop 130 failed with 52% voting no on the new restrictions for logging companies. Its failure marked another battle in the timber wars, as campaigns across Northern California to stop overlogging and clear-cutting continued throughout the 90s. The Alameda District Attorney finally announced 7 grueling weeks after the investigation that Judy wouldn't be charged, as there was insufficient evidence to suggest that she and Cherney were knowingly transporting an explosive. All evidence suggested that the bomb was an anti-personnel device meant to kill Judy Bari. It was also revealed that the FBI never investigated any of the death threats that Judy received, despite her turning the letters into them. Judy Bari died of cancer on May 2, 1997, at just 47 years old. It wouldn't be until 2002, when she and Cherney's federal civil rights suit against Oakland PD and the FBI would be completed, and her estate awarded $4.4 million in damages by the Oakland police. The suit was filed in 1991, and she died before learning the result. The case of who planted the bomb remains technically unsolved to this day. Knowledge of the operational style of the FBI's COINTELPRO program also marks their involvement as suspicious.
The decision to arrest was based on the placement of the device in the vehicle, the nature of its construction, physical and other evidence that we developed.
When I understand, the police have been very adamant from the very beginning. They say have no other suspects but this couple. They aren't even looking into that.
Linda, are there any other suspects right now?
Police say they have no other suspects, and they have categorically eliminated the possibility that anyone else tried to kill Judy Bari and Derryl Cherney.
The discovery that the FBI had held a bomb school in Eureka, California 1 month before I was bombed, during which they blew up cars with pipe bombs. In discovery, when Hansen said that there had been this bomb school and that Frank Doyle had been his instructor, and that what they had done practically recreated the same crime scene, the way I heard it, As soon as we walked out of that deposition, I was terrified.
COINTELPRO, though officially ended as a program at this time, was clearly still alive and well. Corporations worked closely with the FBI, media, and private security mercenary firms to recreate the effects of COINTELPRO directly from the fake Earth First communiques they created to the violence and death threats. It wouldn't be a stretch to suggest that what happened during Redwood Summer was an official revival of COINTELPRO in its functional capacities. These tactics would only go on to see more use in subsequent years. For example, the case of Fran Trutt mentioned earlier, which took place 3 years after the attack on Judi Bari. One similarity between their cases was the weaponization of homophobia and slut-shaming as a tactic in the courtroom, as the media and corporations both heavily depicted the two women as promiscuous lesbian terrorists. As actions continued into the next decade with increasing furiosity and frequency, the 90s began to see the culmination of some of the efforts to stop the ALF, ELF, Earth First, and similar forms of organizing. One particular activist from San Jose, an indigenous eco-anarchist named Rod Coronado, gained notoriety for a series of actions he participated in throughout the late 80s and early 90s, known among ALF members as Operation Bite Back. Coronado was a seasoned activist, personally participating in the sinking of 2 whaling ships in the 80s as a member of the Sea Shepherds, and numerous actions during his run with Earth First. In May of 1991, an ALF cell he was involved in liberated an Oregon State University animal fur research station. The group did over $750,000 in damages, destroying the equipment, files, and research, and finally burning down the lab after removing the animals. A week later, they targeted the Washington-based food cooperative that supplied the feed for the minks. On August 21, 1991, an ALF cell raided a research facility on Washington State University campus, where they poured acid on computers, destroyed files, and freed 24 animals. A quote from the website Anarchy in Action reads,
"The group split into 3 teams. The first team crawled through the ceiling crawl space to enter the office of researcher Joe Gorham, who was out of town receiving the Department of Agriculture's Researcher of the Year award. The team proceeded to smash Gorham's computer equipment and pour muriatic acid over all of his files. The second team cut their way into the mink barns and put the minks into a wire cage in order to release them later. Third, a cell member cut through the fences containing the coyotes. Coronado describes what happened next. While most of the coyotes fled the area immediately, others could be heard in the distance howling from the dark shadows of the wild, as we heard them before. Meanwhile, one coyote hung back, attempting to sneak past the liberator to the last cage. The warrior then noticed the last cage coyote to be a young female who eyed the hesitant coyote with anticipation. As the liberator swung open the last cage, the 2 coyotes bolted off together into the darkness as stars shot across the sky in magical brilliance. Tears soaked the liberator's face mask as they realized the love these last 2 coyotes had for one another, so strong that one refused to leave this hell until the other was also free.
In 1992, another arson attack took place, this one on Michigan State University campus. The attack did $200,000 in damages and finally prompted legal response in the form of legislation. After much corporate lobbying and pressure, the Animal Enterprise Protection Act was signed into law on August 4, 1992. A few years later, in 1995, Coronado was apprehended. He pled guilty to aiding the aforementioned arson, but nothing else, only doing so as a plea deal. He was sentenced to 57 months in jail and a $2.5 million fine. He did not name or betray any accomplices he may have had. All in all, the number of ALF and ELF actions that took place in the United States alone number in the likely thousands. Together, the 2 groups caused damage in the tens of millions to animal cruelty-fueled corporations and universities alike. Much of the struggle of indigenous people in this period, and still now, involved environmental issues and also prompted aggressive disruption, over-policing, and violence from the state.
Sovereign territory is federal U.S. agreements between this nation and the U.S. government.
2 nations.
And it has been completely violated. And the violations have been this. It is not about the operations, it is that the territory and the Caddo Nation was not notified that these operations were pending, that this operation had been in procedure for 8 years. They were not notified that none of the artifacts were removed. That is complete violation of the treaty agreements with the U.S. government.
Indigenous land dispossession in the U.S. has always been accompanied by the devastation of the environments those people live in. For many indigenous peoples, American presence meant, and still means, the annihilation of their ways of natural subsistence via polluted waterways or intentional genocide of keystone species they rely on, for example, buffalo. The capitalist class's desire to end the existence of the environmental and animal rights groups that fought them was not a sentiment held exclusively against the ALF and ELF. It is important to note that the forms of repression pioneered in their use against the ALF and ELF would see their future deployments most prominently in indigenous communities. The repression of environmentalists and indigenous communities via corporate-sponsored COINTELPRO operations continues into the next millennium and now.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
They are anti-technology, they're anti-capitalism. I think they're more of a socialist or Marxist kind of philosophy, and they're digging at the basic roots of the United States and its Constitution. And I think they're a significant threat to the American way of life.
The first use of the term eco-terrorism came from a corporate entity. A man named Ron Arnold first coined the term in 1983 in an article written for a right-wing, pro-free market outlet called Reason Magazine. A former Boeing employee, Ron Arnold served as the vice president of a think tank called the Center for Defense of Free Enterprise, using it and his writings to fight against the environmentalist movement. He began advocating for a concept which he called wise use, which encouraged opening up federal lands and wilderness to various forms of development, such as logging and construction. Ron Arnold was a staunch ally of corporations and an enemy of environmentalists, using both his personal platform and his think tanks in order to push corporate narratives and villainize environmentalists as terrorists. In his 1983 article, he attempts to literally accuse the entire environmental movement, whether peaceful, disruptive, or not, of aiding and abetting and benefiting from eco-terrorism.
Even mid-range environmental groups can promote eco-terrorism indirectly, without open advocacy or actual participation, by publishing and advertising the works of extremists, and by refusing to dissociate themselves from such people. The research of Gerlach and Hein makes the benefits of eco-terrorism to mid-range groups quite transparent. Radical environmentalists tend to believe that one cannot work within the system to change it, since they feel it to be responsible for not only pollution and ecological destruction, but also the major ills of poverty, racism, and war. The radicals' solution, as pointed out by environmentalists Alexander Cockburn and James Ridgway in Political Ecology, is structural attack on the political and economic system itself. My investigation of eco-terrorism has led me to the conclusion that there is a good deal more to the environmental protection movement than its advocates care to admit. The environmental protection motives are clearly only part of the movement's ideology, and those goals appear to be inimical to free minds and free markets. How else can one interpret the constant offering of coercion as a social model by environmental philosophers, or the constant lobbying for command and control measures by environmental activists? Eco-terrorism is a twofold weapon in achieving coercive command and control. It first burdens private enterprise with economic loss and psychological intimidation, and secondly provides the mid-range political pressure groups with a perspective by which to judge their own proposals as comparatively reasonable.
There is a blatant attempt to create association in his audience between terrorism and any form of ecological action, while casting corporations as poor, weak victims of the big left environmentalist movement and its shadow network of terrorists. To this day, the CDFE maintains a section on their website dedicated to aiding in tracking and reporting eco-terrorism. Though Ron died in 2022, his influence on this time period would be immense and go on to impact our culture in frustratingly undiscussed ways. Ron Arnold's work would go on to influence both the response of corporations like Louisiana Pacific and Pacific Lumber to ecological action, and policymakers such as President George W. Bush Jr. In 1988, during the same hearing where Earth First activists were described as eco-terrorists, that term saw its first real use of consequence in the halls of power. Arnold essentially created a blue point of criminalization, the effect of which we feel today, and from the moment he used the term eco-terrorist, its use would consistently mark the beginning of an escalation of anti-environmentalist violence. This pattern can be observed both with the violence and suppression of Redwood Summer activists and their simultaneous vilification, and in more modern struggles such as Standing Rock and the movement to defend the Atlanta forest. The construction of this kind of rhetoric was essential to the progression of the first Green Scare. The creation of the fear of eco-terrorism was essential to the ability of capitalism and the ruling class to both silence dissent and criminalize it. This wouldn't fully culminate until the post-9/11 period, but even before then there was a clear escalation from the moment the term eco-terrorist is created onward.
What we can see from this string of events is a vocal opposition to the environmental movement that begins by creating a fear-based, dehumanized image of these activists as eco-terrorists. This image is then used in moves to criminalize specific tactics and protest methods of this particular political group. And with public investigations in the late 1980s, direct the general public's opinions toward viewing Earth liberation and animal liberationists in a negative way. Following 9/11, fear and nationalism are used to stoke a massive government effort to catch and prosecute environmental activists instead of more dangerous far-right groups. This is all done with support from the industries these environmental activists seek to expose, and the intention of squashing a movement that threatens the fundamental values of state power in America.
This actually mirrors a strategy used by the Nixon campaign to discredit anti-war activists and the civil rights movement. The Nixon campaign worked to create an association in the minds of the American people between hippies with marijuana and blacks with cocaine, criminalizing both drugs heavily as a cover for criminalizing the movements they trained Americans to associate them with, namely the anti-war left and the civil rights movement. Thus, they could claim to simply be fighting drugs and crime, while their actions actually worked to repress. With the Green Scare, the script is flipped from black people and civil rights with drugs to any form of pro-animal, pro-environment activism with literal terrorism, conflating tree-hugging teenagers who at their most radical swore to never harm anyone with literal mass murderers. One of the goals of these affiliations is to create an atmosphere where stochastic right-wing terror can be intentionally incited by the state and weaponized. In the modern day, the legalization of the act of running over protesters in states like Florida, where such right-wing terroristic attitudes are common, serve as a boon to the state. If they can incite violence against you, they don't have to pay to do it themselves or deal with any potential lawsuits or bad press.
Anger and violence against environmentalists is nothing new. What is new is that these attacks have increased in number and have become deadly serious.
They didn't say anything. They ran up behind me and they punched me and hit me. And they just came out of nowhere. And I didn't even know I was stabbed. I just thought they had beat me, and they ran off, and then someone screamed and said, "You're bleeding," and I don't remember much after that.
As with Redwood Summer, where there was a clear effort from corporations to incite workers to violence to serve their interests. These lies pushed through the mainstream media work to manufacture consent in the public for policies that actually harm them and make them less free and less safe. Bringing back an earlier example, the 1988 Anti-Drug Act was marketed to people as being to stop illegal drug cultivation. But in the Senate hearing, they found themselves more obsessed with ranting about the supposed dangers of eco-terrorism. Rebecca K. Smith provides a concise summary of these hearings. During a discussion regarding the use of booby traps by those attempting to protect marijuana crops being grown on public land, Senator James McClure turned the conversation to what he called eco-terrorists, who he claimed were just as dangerous and deadly as the drug producers. With virtually no corroborating evidence, McClure claimed terrorist thugs were driving citizens off the public lands. Because of McClure's claims, Congress enacted punishment for the use of hazardous or injurious devices on public land. A piece of legislation that was originally focused on illegal drug production on public land was expanded to make certain forms of environmental protest much more difficult. As Smith notes, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has also held in a 2005 decision that even a rope tied between trees during a tree sit protest qualifies as a hazardous or injurious device. To the wider public not actively tapped into and paying attention to these conversations, or only learning about it through corporate media, which shares the same material interests in the machinations of capital as the companies destroying the environment, the actual agenda of the bill, suppressing activists, would be missed. This disruption is not merely the goal of the state, but of capitalists as a system. The attempts to crush environmental struggles that characterized the pre-9/11 era of the Green Scare would pale in comparison to the advancement of those repressive forces in the mere days after the towers fell, and be felt 2 decades into the future. Besides passing the Animal Enterprise Protection Act to cease environmental action and protect their blood-fueled interests, corporations continued lobbying. In 1998, mere months after the 1997 Cable West facility arson in Redmond, Oregon, which destroyed a slaughterhouse where wild horses were butchered for meat, the Justice Department held a conference on eco-terrorism where the director of the Fur Trade Commission was allowed to speak. By 1999, the FBI was already stating its commitment to hunt down so-called eco-terrorists. Mere days after the 9/11 attacks, Alaska Governor and Republican Don Young said this:
"War has been declared as far as terrorists go," Young said in a phone interview from his home. Young warned against rushing to the conclusion that Middle Eastern terrorists were responsible. There's some possibility, he said, that the attacks are linked to the protests against the World Trade Organization, another of which is scheduled for later this month in Washington, D.C. If you watched what happened at past protests in Genoa, in Italy, and even in Seattle, there's some expertise in that field, Young said. I'm not sure they're that dedicated, but eco-terrorists, which are really based in Seattle, there's a strong possibility that that could be one of the groups.
As the name of the game in American politics became counterterrorism, lobbyists, cops, and politicians wasted no time exaggerating the danger of eco-activists. Post-9/11 America's counterterrorism obsession allowed the government and lobbyists to ramp up the practice of salaciously labeling environmental activists as terrorists, which allowed the public to turn a blind eye as their neighbors became the target of FBI scrutiny, and gave authorities more power to go after them. In that time, even baseless accusations were enough to give the feds a blank check to spy on, intimidate, and harass even the most liberal milquetoast expressions of giving a shit about the environment or animals.
No new law was required to treat eco-saboteurs as terrorists in the wake of 9/11. Of 70 federal prosecutions of radical environmentalists and animal rights activists identified by The Intercept, 52 did not result in charges under the anti-terrorism laws. Yet, the defendants were repeatedly called terrorists by the Justice Department in public statements and internal communications. The designation opened up additional resources and gave the government powerful leverage in the form of terrorism sentencing enhancements, which prosecutors sought in more than 20 cases.
The aforementioned Will Potter being a prime example, as his experience being subjected to this harassment prompted him to be among the first to use the term Green Scare.
This new law, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, has just been applied for the first time to 2 cases. Individuals who are accused of releasing mink from fur farms, and individuals in California who aren't accused of anything except protesting, leafleting, and wearing bandanas at lawful protests. This is the extent to which the government is willing to go to criminalize dissent. And I think it would be a mistake to think that this is going to turn around with the Obama administration, which these arrests have happened under the Obama administration and Obama Justice Department. And it's also a mistake to think that if we just kind of hunker down, we can wait for it to pass over. Once they round up people that are actually accused of illegal actions, the crackdown's going to stop. And what we're seeing is it's not stopping with the people that have actually done illegal things. These industry groups have labeled the Humane Society as a terrorist organization. They've labeled mainstream organizations like the Sierra Club as eco-terrorists. I mean, they really have no limits to the extent they're willing to go.
1 week after the Patriot Act was signed into law, an eco-activist named Craig Rosenbrough received a subpoena from Congress to testify in court. Rosenbrough was not an on-the-ground activist. He didn't participate in any illegal actions. He merely received anonymous communiques and shared them with the public. He was a spokesperson for the ELF. That didn't stop Congress members from ranting in the chambers about eco-terrorism and acts of violence which had nothing to do with him, and claiming that ELF actions which harmed no one were equal in terms to the damage of the 9/11 attacks.
Rosebrough tried to turn the tables on his accusers. If the US government is truly concerned with eradicating terrorism in the world, then that effort must begin with abolishing US imperialism, he wrote in prepared remarks. Members of this governing body, both in the House and Senate, as well as those who hold positions in the executive branch, constitute the largest group of terrorists and terrorist representatives currently threatening life on this planet. Lawmakers at the hearing proposed various legislative fixes, including an Agro-Terrorism Prevention Act, which would have made activists eligible for the death penalty if someone were to die in one of these arsons. That bill was never passed, but another proposal, an expansion of the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, did become law, with help from industry.
In 2006, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act would be signed into law after heavy corporate lobbying. By that point, though, the Green Scare was already well underway. One of the first prominent cases began in 2004 when 6 US-based activists from the organization Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty were arrested on charges of inciting harassment against Huntington Life Sciences via the organization's website. The site was used as a method of spreading information about allegations of animal cruelty done by HLS, as well as a place to post information on their shareholders and affiliates, presumably allowing other activists to commit direct action against them. The 6 implemented in this case: Kevin Jonas, the former president of Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, Lauren Gazzola, Jacob Conroy, Joshua Harper, Andrew Stepanian, Darius Fulmer, and John McGee, did not themselves engage in a single act of violence or harassment. They only ran the website. HLS itself stood accused of numerous acts of animal cruelty, including leaked videos of employees beating puppies, testing pesticides, food additives, and cleaning chemicals, and pharmaceuticals on captured baboons, dogs, and other animals, and dissecting live animals, to the tune of 75,000 animals per year. But God forbid anything happened to those guys, I guess. McGee was later dropped from the case, and the 6 were ultimately charged with being in violation of the 1992 edition of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, as well as stalking via the internet. The SHAC website was not by any means the only source of resistance against HLS's cruelty, and the defense hinged on the fact that the prosecution couldn't prove that the SHAC 7's posts were directly tied to any actions against the company. What the website did was effectively journalism, and this was a clear attempt by the state and corporations to clamp down on objective free speech. The 6 were charged with a sum of 24 years in prison between them, and fined over $1 million. In 2005, the FBI began implementing what they called Operation Backfire. This was a campaign of arrests against several ALF and ELF cells, bringing together multiple cases from the FBI's Portland field office in an effort to close the cases of several arsons across the 90s and early 2000s. This was a large-scale operation as described by the FBI that brought in both the Oregon State Police, the FBI, and the ATF. The operation, in their own words, targeted the most prolific domestic terrorism cell of all time. The initial investigations in Operation Backfire began as far back as 2001 and were incredibly sloppy. Initial detective work amounted to little more than harassing local drunk punks at night and demanding information, and tracking the most prominent community members, often to dead ends or meaningless gossip.
In March 2001, for example, a large-scale police raid was carried out on a house party attended by Portland punk rockers. The attendees were photographed and questioned about the Earth and Animal Liberation fronts. Some were arrested and charged with kidnapping and assault on an officer, a standard overcharging which eventually led to plea deals. The defendants from the raid were videotaped at their court appearances by officers later identified as Gang Enforcement Unit members. In the aftermath of this raid, cops routinely harassed punks on the street, demanding to be told whether they were anarchists. In retrospect, it seems likely that such efforts were not meant simply to intimidate Portland's punks, but to uncover information relevant to the anarchist and ALF-ELF cases of the time.
That particular cell was only the opening salvo, for within the next year the FBI's list of accused would grow to 18 people. The initial accused in the operation were Joseph Mahmoud Deby, Chelsea Dawn Gerlach, Sarah Kendall Harvey, Daniel McGowan, Stanislas Meyerhoff, Josephine Sunshine Overacre, Jonathan Paul, Rebecca Jeanette Rubin, Suzanne Stavoy, Justin Franchi Salons, Darren Thurston, Kevin Tubbs, and Brianna Waters, as well as an unnamed 8th conspirator and a 9th who committed suicide in prison before he could be convicted, named William Rogers. Altogether, they were given 65 charges of arson, conspiracy, and destroying an energy facility. Not terrorism charges. despite them being framed as and called terrorists in the media and courts. These accusations were part of a specific ALF cell based in Eugene, Oregon, and involved 2 alleged arsons, one at a ski resort and one at a lab in Washington state. Not all of the accused were caught immediately. Solans, Rubin, DeBee, and Overaker all went into hiding. Solans was found overseas in Dali, China in 2009 after being arrested on marijuana charges there. DeBee was caught by Cuban and American law enforcement trying to board a plane to Russia in 2018. Rubin surrendered in 2012, and Overaker is still in hiding to this day.
Of those charged in Operation Backfire, 9 ultimately cooperated with the government and informed on others in hopes of reduced sentences. Stanislaus Meyerhoff, Kevin Tubbs, Chelsea Dawn Gerlach, Suzanne Savoy, Kendall Tankersley, Jennifer Kolar, Lacey Philibom, Darren Thurston, and, much later, Brianna Waters. 4 held out through a terrifying year, during which it seemed certain they would end up serving decades in prison, until they were able to broker plea deals in which they could claim responsibility for their actions without providing information about others. Daniel McGowan, Jonathan Paul, Exile, aka Nathan Block, and Sadie, aka Joyanna Zacher. Another defendant, William Rogers, aka Avalon, tragically passed away in an alleged suicide while in custody shortly after his arrest. Fugitive Justin Solans was captured in China in 2009 and completed his sentence in January 2017. Rebecca Rubin turned herself in 2012 after many years on the run and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Joseph Dibby was extradited from Cuba to the U.S. in August 2018 to face charges. One more defendant has been charged but not found. Perhaps most ominously of all, 3 young people were set up by an agent provocateur and arrested on conspiracy charges without having actually done anything at all. 2 of them, Zachary Jensen and Lauren Weiner, pled guilty and became government informants. The third, Eric McDavid, served 9 years in prison before his conviction was overturned when it was finally acknowledged that the FBI had withheld exculpatory evidence.
Trial continues in the case of a suspected Earth Liberation Front member accused of conspiring to destroy government property, including the Nimbus Dam in Sacramento County. 29-year-old defendant Eric McDavid's role in the plot is unclear.
Weiner has already pled guilty to conspiracy to commit arson. In exchange for a lesser sentence, she testified today against 29-year-old Eric McDavid of Forestville, an alleged ELF member. The group of conspirators included Weiner, McDavid, Zachary Jensen, who plea bargained, and a 21-year-old undercover FBI informant going by the name Anna. Weiner testified about the group's desire to take, quote, direct action using explosives. The group was suspected of targeting Nimbus Dam and fish hatchery and U.S. Forest Service facilities. The defense team's key argument is based upon entrapment. Their claim that defendant Eric McDavid was pushed into a plot facilitated by an FBI undercover informant.
There was no predisposition on behalf of Mr. McDavid to start with, and that there was inducement on behalf of the government throughout their investigation in this case.
These cases shocked the anarchist community nationwide. The zine Green Scared compares the anarchist community's reaction to that of Americans after 9/11. Action this sweeping against ecological protesters and militants was almost unprecedented at the time. The accused activists faced decades in prison, and the panic it caused made some leave the movement entirely, and others turned snitch as the pressure mounted. All in all, the scare stifled ecological actions among the anarchist community, and action in general for several years. Other activists also faced renewed scrutiny or harassment because of the Green Scare. Rod Coronado, for example, found himself once again in the scope of the FBI and arrested after giving a demonstration on improvised explosive devices.
In 2007, he was prosecuted again, but this time he was prosecuted for terrorism. Now, Rod has always sort of been intimately involved with the sort of creeping progression of the definition of terrorism for radical activists in this country over the last 15, 20 years. Because a couple anyways of the laws that were passed about domestic federal terrorism were passed partly because of him. In 2003 is where this latest bit begins. He was doing a series of talks across the country, which was his sort of standard activist action at that point. Was he was doing some talks in which he would talk about the whaling action, he would talk about his anti-fur campaign, and as part of that series of talks, he did a talk in San Diego at a gay lesbian center there. It was an open talk, public talk, you know, it was advertised throughout the local activist community there. And as part of his talk, he answered a question at the end during the Q&A period from someone in the audience who said, "How did you make these incendiaries?" This was a standard question that Rod evidently had answered many times before. His take on that question was that this was an easy thing to do. He wanted to show that he was not some sort of bombing madman or some kind of, you know, a demolitions expert. But he held up a jug of gasoline, or a jug of apple juice, and said, you know, imagine this was filled with gasoline. And then he went on to describe very briefly that you could do a number of different things that would make that burn, and then run away. And that was the sense, you know, that was the essence of his type of incendiary device. There were federal agents, or federal task force agents anyways, in the audience that night, as there always are at a Rodney Coronado speech. They decided that this was incitement, and that under the rules of the federal terrorism law that had developed by 2003, that this was a crime of not just incitement to arson, but that this was a crime of federal terrorism. And it took a number of years to put the case together, but in 2007 they finally went to trial on that. There was a hung jury, and the government came back to Rod and said, guess what, we have a whole bunch of your speeches on tape. We are happy to prosecute all of those speeches. And Rodney, who at that point has 2 young children and is really trying to put his family together, decided that it would be better for him to take a plea and do a year than to go through all these prosecutions, so he took a plea.
Nonviolent activists found themselves being stalked, intimidated, and watched by the FBI. Even random punks across the Pacific Northwest were at times arrested and harassed by police, demanding to know if they were part of the ALF. The investigations to find these activists weren't carried out perfectly, and what ultimately did the most to land activists in jail was the intimidation of police, causing them to snitch and inform on one another. The zine Green Scared points out that pretty consistently, activists who refused to cooperate with the police and courts received lower sentences than those who informed, questioning the value of the decision some activists made to cooperate for a lower sentence. Plea bargains are often used to make innocent people serve time for crimes they haven't even committed, because they're told that the sentence will be worse if things go to trial. But this is not axiomatic. Often police and courts slam defendants with very heavy, scary charges that can't possibly stick early on to get them to take a deal.
The pressure on the eco-radicals to inform on their friends in exchange for reduced prison time was immense. Hanging over their heads were terrorism sentencing enhancements developed in the wake of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which could increase prison time for a specific list of crimes if they were calculated to influence or affect the conduct of government by intimidation or coercion, or to retaliate against government conduct. Among the charges that fit the enhancement were arson of buildings involved in interstate commerce or belonging to the U.S. government. Given the prison time at stake, with some facing possible life sentences, nearly every activist shared information. Some named every name they could, Harvey said, while others listed involvement without naming names. Prosecutors declined to negotiate with the handful of defendants who refused to cooperate, according to Regan. But that changed overnight, she said, after defense lawyers issued an extensive motion demanding the government reveal whether the National Security Agency, or FBI, had used warrantless wiretapping or Patriot Act authorized surveillance against the activists. When the judge supported the motion and prosecutors changed their tune, they said, "Okay, we'll do a non-cooperating plea deal if you'll drop this motion," Regan recalled.
This period in time set the tone for the next 20 or so years of battles between the state and ecological activists as the era of climate collapse advanced with no systemic action to stop it. It is in this period after the Green Scare that an anonymous author pens a book called Desert. Desert, published in 2011, and Blessed is the Flame, published in 2016, occupy similar cultural spaces to some in the ecological movement as Silent Spring in the 60s, presenting a bleak and contentious view of climate realism. Both of these books are in the vein of anarchism and specifically anarchist nihilism. Anarcho-nihilists in the present day believe in a sort of pessimistic futurism when they believe in a concept of time or a future at all. Desert, by an anonymous author, was an exceptionally prominent piece of anarchist literature in the early 2010s, partly because at the time its assertion that climate change was impossible to stop was a pretty revolutionary piece of climate realism that was beforehand not a widely believed or understood assertion. Today it's something that people mostly know as a fact. Like it or not, climate change is probably now the context in which ecological struggles are fought, not a subject against which one can struggle. Desert essentially seeks to both grapple at times in a spirit of genuine optimism with a future where climate change is inevitable and unstoppable, and criticizes the modes of thought and being that led us here. In Blessed is the Flame, the author Serafinski, a pseudonym as mentioned, uses the concentration camps run by the Nazis during World War II, and specifically the resistance that took place within them, as a framework to sketch out a new perspective on action in the face of climate collapse. It and Desert are both famous works of climate realism, but Serafinski seeks to inspire more direct and immediate actions, and provide an alternative way of looking at resistance, so that when hope for a better future no longer serves as motivation, a love of the act of resistance itself can be that motivation instead. The author of Blessed is the Flame is of a similar mind to Desert's, though in my opinion presents the ideas a little better. Both texts grapple with and try to understand the present moment of resistance in the era of climate change, and encourage continued direct action and resistance. Blessed is the Flame uses records of resistance in concentration camps to draw a line between the mentality of those struggling in the camps during World War II to our struggle against climate change now, both critiquing and explaining the actions people took at the time. It is a work deeply concerned with the mental machinations of complacency, and finding new motivations for struggle in the absence of hope.
A different approach. We have already been led to our slaughter. It's all around us. The world in which we exist is a protracted death, a sort of economically sustained limbo in which hearts are permitted to beat only to the extent that they can facilitate the upward stream of capital. The plague of domestication has reached into every wild space, and the lines of colonization have crossed us more times than we can count. We who still have air in our lungs are the living dead, and struggle daily to remember what it feels like to be alive, holding tightly to the desire for wildness that the misery of a paycheck cannot allay. We roam the desolate architecture of our slaughterhouses, the prison of civilization we live in, like ghosts who feel but cannot quite understand the vapidity of our existence.
These works are not, however, the focus of this project, but they represent a cultural shift in the 2010s of the ecological and anarchist movements as a whole. In the past, ecological struggles were fought with a mentality that the movement could win definitively. Activists struggled in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as they watched the world degrade, but fairly major steps still be taken. An example being the repair of the ozone layer hole detected in the 1980s. It showed that collective action could make lasting change even as climate change was proven to be real and progressed. Activists living through the Green Scare had no such luxury. To many in the movement, they grew up knowing only advancing ecocide and repression in the face of it. Watching the world burn as children, then being labeled terrorists and beaten by cops as adults for trying to stop it. And yet the struggle continued.
Mendocino, no neutrals can there be. You're either an earth firster or you're slaving for LP.
When I sit in contemplation of the human situation, I often get a certain sense of pride. Our achievements are many and mighty. The evidence cannot be denied.
While the first Green Scare was marked as a specific period in time, that doesn't mean that when that specific period ended, those tools unleashed upon eco-activists were put away in the toolshed. Rather, it marked a new brutal precedent that would continue to display itself in the future. The resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline is probably the example at the forefront of many minds. Indeed, counterterrorism forces were mobilized to crush those protests, alongside the age-old images of police dogs and water cannons breaking black and brown bodies on the riot line, came the newer, more quietly insidious whispers of modern state surveillance. Much like the ALF before them, indigenous activists and their allies were labeled terrorists and had full military and legal might ready to be deployed against them in the name of those allegations. The private security firm Tiger Swan, hired by Energy Transfer Partners, the company that was building the pipeline, described the indigenous-led movements as jihadists, as it worked closely with the police to surveil and suppress these protests. This is another standard set by the first Green Scare, police allowing private security firms working on behalf of corporations, and corporations themselves, broad-sweeping policing powers in line with COINTELPRO operations done by the FBI. Tiger Swan's employees went so far as to utilize dogs to suppress protests themselves. The phrase security firm does a lot of heavy lifting here. For the average person who hears that phrase, you think of the private security firms that protect celebrities or harass teenagers and homeless people outside of a local Walmart. Tiger Swan is not like that. They are more accurately described as mercenaries, and their actions are much better understood through that lens. Tiger Swan got its start and still maintains bases in the Middle East, helping protect American investments there. Therefore, it should be cause for considerable alarm that, much like American military operations in the Middle East being bolstered and partially managed by private mercenary armies, the police in America made similar inroads, establishing joint commands with Tiger Swan when they weren't even licensed to operate in North Dakota at any point during the months-long protests, a violation they are to this day being sued over.
Covert operations are implicit in many of the other situation reports, which are filled with details that only individuals with close and consistent access to the protesters' communities could have gathered. On a few occasions, however, the reports make that presence more explicit, for instance, by referring to sources in the camp. For example, the November 5th Situation Report describes the exploitation of documents found at Camp 1. Apparently, they didn't contain much revealing material. Of most concern, the Situation Report says, were the Earth First magazines found on the camp. These magazines promote and provide TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures for violent activity. In an October 3 report, Tiger Swan discusses how to use its knowledge of internal camp dynamics, exploitation of ongoing native versus non-native rifts, and tribal rifts between peaceful and violent elements is critical in our effort to delegitimize the anti-DAPL movement. On February 19th, Tiger Swan makes explicit its plans to infiltrate a Chicago protest group. Tiger Swan collections team will make contact with event organizers to embed within the structure of the demonstration to develop a trusted agent status to be cultivated for future collection efforts, the report noticed. Tiger Swan collections team will make contact with event organizers to embed within the structure of the demonstration to develop a trusted agent status to be cultivated for future collection efforts, the report notes, later repeating its intent to covertly make contact with event organizers. At every action I went to, they had their own people walking around with a video camera getting in people's faces. Ian Schauter, a protester who was described as a person of interest in a Tiger Swan report, told The Intercept. Perhaps one of the most striking revelations of the documents is the level of hostility displayed by Tiger Swan toward the water protectors. Tiger Swan consistently describes the peaceful demonstrators using military and tactical language more appropriate for counterterrorism operations in an armed conflict zone. At times, the military language verges on parody, as when agents write of protesters stockpiling signs or when they discuss the caliber of paintball pellets. More often, however, the way Tiger Swan discusses protesters as terrorists, their direct actions as attacks, and the camps as a battlefield reveals how the protesters' dissent was not only criminalized, but treated as a national security threat. A March 1st report states that protesters' operational weakness allows TC elements to further develop and dictate the battle space. In one internal report dated May 4th, a Tiger Swan operative describes an effort to amass digital and ground intelligence that would allow the company to find, fix, and eliminate threats to the pipeline, an eerie echo of find, fix, finish, a military term used by special forces in the US government's assassination campaign against terrorist targets. Leaked document reveal counterterrorism tactics used at Standing Rock to defeat pipeline insurgencies. Eileen Brown, The Intercept.
To sum up, Tiger Swan worked directly in a multi-agency coalition between state and local police, the FBI, BIA, Justice Department, and private security. Tiger Swan provided aerial surveillance, person of interest lists of activists for police to track down, at times directly used violence to help suppress protests, and worked to incite police to be more aggressive in their dealings with protesters. On top of suppressing the protests and spying on them for the police, Tiger Swan was put in charge of defending the image of its benefactors and creating counter-narratives and propaganda online that swayed public opinion in their favor. The fact that these corporations can have such a direct hand in the suppression of these protests was, in my opinion, a practice normalized in the modern day by corporations fighting environmental activists through the last 40 or so years and the early stages of the first Green Scare. The escalating trend of militarized police response to environmental activism and the association of such activists with terrorism continued into the new millennium. In 2021, the city of Atlanta announced plans for a vote to proceed with a 2017 proposal for a new police training facility built in the South River Forest area of DeKalb County, the heart of what is known by locals and indigenous communities as the Weelaunee Forest. The facility will cost taxpayers over $90 million, likely more, and spans over 85 acres. Public comment on the vote lasted over 17 hours, and the vast majority, over 70%, were against the proposed facility. Regardless, the City Council voted to approve the project by a 10-4 margin. Anti-cop city voices were removed from the later established Community Advisory Committee. There are a plethora of reasons to oppose this proposal. For one, Atlanta is already the most surveilled city in the United States, with a history of unchecked police misconduct, murder, and corruption. Speaking of the police department in question, reveals a legacy of corruption that rivals the LAPD. Just the other day, at time of writing, an APD officer was charged with murder for shooting his Lyft driver 3 times. He claimed the driver was part of a gay fraternity and trying to recruit him. The officer, Kobe Minor, was already on unpaid leave over drug charges when the killing took place. Last year, just a few months after the highly publicized killing of Manuel Terán by state police, APD killed 62-year-old Deacon Johnny Hallman during a routine traffic stop after tasing him repeatedly while he was restrained, and later used rulings about Terán's killing and footage as an excuse to delay releasing the footage of Hallman's murder. Last October, APD officer Anthony Anderson was arrested for sexually assaulting a minor he met in August while responding to a car accident. Another officer, Howard Portis, went down for sexually assaulting a woman while responding to a burglary in her home, and was known for having a history of turning off his body cam before making unwanted sexual advances on women. In the past, Atlanta PD had the now disbanded Red Dog Unit, a special task force used to go after drug-related crimes. They were disbanded and replaced with the Apex Unit, which was later itself disbanded and replaced by another unit with a stupid name, because of its extensive record of members engaging in police brutality, racial profiling, and murder. In 2016, members of the unit murdered 26-year-old Jamarian Robinson, and falsely claimed he pointed a gun at them, even though witness testimony declared him unarmed and not presenting an active threat to officers. Terán and Jamarian's killers all still wear the badge. Hallman's killer was fired but is appealing the decision and faces no charges. Meanwhile, over 3,000 people sit in pretrial detention in Fulton County Jail's pretrial detention system, which is barely equipped for half that load. All of the people in these jails are awaiting their trial dates, innocent until proven guilty according to the Constitution, but unable to make bail. In November of last year, the understaffed, overcrowded jail made headlines as Georgia's Senate began an investigation into a surge in deaths in the jail. Since 2023, 13 people have died in custody there, the most recent being April 5th this year. This jail being one of the facilities protesters may be sent to after an arrest and charge, which they may now be forced to spend even more time at because the bail system has been reformatted to better repress activists. Environmentally speaking, the Atlanta forest serves as an important check against flooding and heat waves, both of which are exacerbated by climate change. It also serves as vital habitat for over 175 different species of plants and animals, several of which are federally endangered. Those include the Altamaha shiner and the Michaux sumac. The forest also sits on land that is vital historically to both the state of Georgia and its legacies of slavery and genocide through the old Atlanta prison farm, but also through the Muskogee people, who were the original inhabitants of the land, and from whom the forest gets its name. For those reasons, experts have recommended it be officially labeled both a protected site for environmental reasons and a historical landmark. The Stop Cop City movement sits at a unique juncture among protest movements in America. This is not merely an environmental justice movement, but is fundamentally tied to the struggle against police violence and for racial justice, a veritable three-way fight for activists. The community nearby is predominantly black and working class. Black communities are already subject to some of the worst environmental conditions in America via air pollution, runoff, and other factors. They also tend to have less access to tree cover and green spaces, and therefore the demolition of the Weelaunee Forest disrupts the ability of black community members to access and enjoy nature, as well as reap the benefits of proximity to the forest, such as better air, less susceptibility to heat waves, and protection from flood damage during storms, as the forest is also a vital floodplain. It is not an exaggeration to say this project is an existential threat to Atlanta's already dropping black population. Members of nearby communities are already subject to hours daily of police firing their guns at the nearby police firing range, and with the facility's completion would also be subject to the sounds of bombs, helicopters, and more. On top of this, the pollution output from the facility would be a major risk to groundwater and other water sources through runoff that would contain chemicals and pollution from the expended ammunition and explosives on site, and basically guaranteeing a drop in air quality. Before any direct action took place, objectors to Cop City had already exhausted every legal means of objection, and multiple organizations across Atlanta had organized an objection to the proposal, and continued to hold marches, rallies, teach-ins, and more community-building forms of resistance and education. Things were pretty strictly in the legal sphere before protesters felt the need to turn to direct action. Activists disrupted and protested at the offices of contractors involved in the Cop City project, hoping to encourage them to divest from the project. Some of the protesters began to take on a more militant character, with dedicated activists beginning to occupy the forest and force construction workers out nonviolently. By late 2021, there were multiple tree sits active. Activists took a page out of the ALF and ELF's book, targeting the tools of environmental destruction, but not harming any individuals at any point. A statement from one tree sitter calling themselves Wish reads,
"We are here today to stop the development of a police militarization facility where police would train in tactics of repression and violence against the civilians of Atlanta. We are here to stop a beautiful forest from being destroyed, to stop countless animals and plants from being exterminated from this place. Climate change and police violence are two of the most pressing issues affecting our society today, and they will only worsen if this facility is built. We cannot stand by as we sacrifice humanity's future for a Cop City. Wish."
As activists waged effective daylight protest campaigns and militants continued their occupation of the forest, the project's already $90 million price tag began to grow. After over a year of protest, one of the construction contractors on the project, Reeves Young, finally backed out on April 25, 2022. Earlier that year, Reeves Young had multiple of their machines destroyed by activists, as well as machines belonging to one of their subcontractors. Activists also relied partially on external support from solidarity protests and direct actions in other states, targeting the offices of contractors working on Cop City within their state in order to increase pressure. For the last several years, activists have waged an effective long-term campaign against Cop City, embracing a wide diversity of tactics. Over the course of this, police consistently referred to even non-violent activists as domestic terrorists. This terminology would come to have dangerous effects and implications. Far removed from the first Green Scare, where no activists were actually charged with domestic terrorism, despite being referred to as such and treated as such, Cop City represented the culmination of the process of escalation against environmental activists in the U.S. On December 13, 2022, a coalition of multiple law enforcement agencies began conducting raids on the occupiers of the Weelaunee Forest. At 7 a.m., they arrived using tear gas, pepper ball rounds, and other violent methods to force the occupiers out of their tree sits. 5 were arrested that day. The charges levied against them included criminal trespass, obstruction, assault, possession of tools for a crime, destruction of government property, and domestic terrorism. Not even a month later, on January 18, 2023, during another raid involving multiple law enforcement agencies, police surrounded and murdered Manuel Terán, also known as Tortuguita, while they were sitting cross-legged with their hands up in their tent. Terán carried a legally owned firearm. Despite police claiming that the activist shot first, no gunpowder residue could be found on their hands, and no proof the gun was fired could be recovered. An independent autopsy conflicts this narrative.
The full findings conducted by a forensic pathologist, Chris Sperry, MD, on January 31st at the Connor Westbury Funeral Home in Griffin, Georgia, revealed Tortuguita was shot 14 times, with wounds stemming from a mixture of predominantly handgun caliber bullets, as well as both a shotgun slug and shotgun pellets with trajectories that indicate Tortuguita was facing their killers. Sperry's report states, "It is impossible to tell if Tortuguita had been holding a firearm or not holding a firearm, either before they were shot or while they were being shot the multiple times." One observation the report does make is that Tortuguita raised their hands and arms up and in front of their body during the course of the shooting. Sperry also asserts that none of the identified firearm wounds exhibited any evidence of close-range firing, the presence of gunpowder soot and or stippling. This is particularly notable as there were gunshot wounds in both of Tortuguita's hands, which would likely show evidence of gunpowder residue had they fired their gun at the GSP trooper. The report notes that gunpowder residue may have been washed from the body during the first autopsy, but this is very unlikely. These findings stand contrary to early reports released by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, the agency heading the investigation into the killing. According to the GBI, Tortuguita fired on a GSP trooper first and was killed by return fire. 2 days after the raid, the GBI released an image of the Smith & Wesson M&P shield that they alleged Tortuguita shot a trooper with, and stated that there was a ballistic match between the bullet recovered from the injured trooper and Tortuguita's gun. Activists believe that friendly fire caused the trooper's injuries. One of the 4 body camera videos released by the Atlanta Police Department, APD, February 6, supports this assessment. In it, an APD officer can be heard remarking, "You fucked your own guy up," a few minutes after the shooting. At the time, APD released an initial 14 videos to the family's lawyer and 4 videos to the general public. The department separately stated to both the family's lawyers and the general public that more footage would be released on a rolling basis. More than a month later, no additional videos are available. The GBI's lead role in the investigation is an issue for activists as well. They cite the participation of GBI agents in the initial raid that led to the death of Tortuguita as a reason the agency should recuse itself and have an independent investigator take over the case. By Atlanta Community Press Collective, March 13, 2023.
Even after the killing, struggle continued on both fronts as people across the U.S. took to the streets to protest the killing. 3 days later, Tortuguita's comrades marched through downtown Atlanta where they took direct action against direct contributors to Cop City and burned an APD vehicle. 6 arrests were made. Peaceful demonstrations also continued to take place. Defend the Forest supporters in D.C. marched on the homes of Georgia Senators Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff on February 18, 2023, demanding they break their silence on the murder of Tortuguita and put an end to Cop City. A few days later, activists in Philadelphia marched on the offices of Greenberg Traurig, LLP, a law firm that provided funding to and sits on the board of the Atlanta Police Foundation. There, they distributed flyers explaining the organization's link to Cop City and demanded their divestment from the project. March 5, 2023 marked a turning point in the repression of protesters as a direct action at a construction site in the forest led to a clash with police, where protesters forced them back before using firebombs to destroy equipment. The police used this confrontation as an excuse to attack a nearby music festival, where children were playing in bouncy houses and participants were enjoying music in the forest. Police attacked the festival with tear gas and beatings, and detained over 35 people, arresting 22 on charges of domestic terrorism. Before this point, there were already 20 other activists facing those same charges. The justification police gave was that the terrorists were hiding among the crowd of civilians that included children, mothers, elderly, and disabled. This reflects the justification Israel uses for murdering civilians in Palestine. Atlanta PD happens to send its members to train directly with the IDF. On May 15th, over 500 activists flooded Atlanta City Hall to give over 8 hours of public comment ahead of a vote on whether the city would continue to fund the increasingly expensive project. The council voted to continue even as the cost of the project to Atlanta's taxpayers rose from the initial $30 million to over $67 million. The wave of repression also continued, with 3 activists being arrested and charged with felony intimidation of a police officer and misdemeanor stalking for posting flyers revealing the identity of the officer that murdered Tortuguita shortly after the killing. They face over 20 years in prison. Later that same month, 3 organizers from the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, a jail support bail fund, were arrested and charged with money laundering and charity fraud, charges that bring potentially 20 years in prison and a $500,000 fine. DeKalb County DA Sherry Boston's office withdrew from the prosecution on the 42 domestic terrorism charges after reviewing the evidence, which included mud on the protesters' shoes or having written the jail support phone number on their body before a protest, which is a very common practice, even among the most bland of protests. Nothing that actually linked specific people to specific crimes.
District Attorney Boston's entire job is to send people to prison. If she says the evidence isn't there, believe her. Boston noted that her differences with Carr arose despite her confidence that both prosecutorial teams had access to the same information about the cases. This confirms what we knew all along, that the domestic terrorism charges were a baseless overreaction meant to quell dissent against the Stop Cop City project, said Josh Lingich, attorney for one of the defendants charged with domestic terrorism in December. While we are grateful that Ms. Boston finally spoke up, it cannot undo the harm experienced by the defendants who were initially jailed on these unfounded charges. The onus is now on Chris Carr to do the right thing and drop the charges against these defendants. Atlanta Community Press Collective.
August saw the fight against Cop City return to the courtroom as the South River Watershed Alliance, a nonprofit that works to protect the South River through cleanups and community engagement, began a lawsuit under the Federal Clean Water Act against the Atlanta Police Foundation and the City of Atlanta, their hope being to get a court order halting the construction of the police training facility, as SWRA alleges that the project's construction was causing violations of sediment runoff caps placed in Entrenchment Creek by the state. The runoff polluting the creek has a risk of traveling downstream and damaging water quality, animal populations, as well as human communities. The suit alleges that the APF and state were aware that they had not taken the proper steps to prevent runoff, and that the project should be halted until such measures are in place in accordance with the state's own imposed standards. In mid-February of the same year, the U.S. Geological Survey quietly ceased their monitoring of sediment levels in Entrenchment Creek, shutting off their measuring devices due to concerns over safety due to protests. This is deeply suspicious as the initial court filings over this issue were provided as early as February 6th. Academics and environmentalists who attempted to independently measure this data reported being harassed by police. After a hearing for the case in November of 2023, the APF legal counsel argued that a court order to cease construction for even a day would risk them having to abandon the project. They went on to compare building in the forest to building in a war zone, citing an event the day before that saw 12 sediment trucks destroyed by militants protesting the ecocidal development project. On January 16th of this year, the judge in the case, J.P. Boley, ruled against the SRWA's request because according to him, the defendants in the case, the APF and the City of Atlanta, had sufficiently proven that they will comply with best management practices, as well as provided an additional $250,000 toward erosion management.
In sum, plaintiff has brought evidence showing that the sediment is being discharged into Entrenchment Creek. That excess sediment will cause harm to the aquatic species residing there, and at least some of the evidence indicating that the sediment observed in the creek has been caused by the defendants. However, defendants put forth evidence showing that compliance with the general permit's BMPs prevents the discharge of the sediment to cause a water quality problem, and defendants are complying with those BMPs, including the additional BMPs required for impaired waters like the Entrenchment Creek. Moreover, defendants submitted evidence of construction site testing that indicates the BMPs are working as designed, and defendants are not contributing excess sediment to the stream. As a result, the court cannot find at this stage of the proceedings that plaintiff has presented enough evidence to prove there is a substantial likelihood that defendant's construction of the facility is discharging enough sediment to interfere with Entrenchment Creek's designated use and thereby violate Georgia's water quality standards. Since plaintiff's CWA case hinges on the defendant's alleged violation of the general permit provision that prohibits violation of Georgia's water quality standards, the court likewise cannot find that there is a substantial likelihood that the CWA has been violated. At least in this stage of the case, plaintiff has not provided enough evidence to warrant the extraordinary and dramatic remedy of a preliminary injunction. J.P. Boley, USDJ.
In September of 2023, 61 people would be indicted on RICO charges. These people were indicted in this case for things as simple as Venmo transactions to the jail support fund. This wasn't the only step taken to repress this form of support for activists. Along with the RICO charges and arrests, in January of this year, the state of Georgia passed new legislation criminalizing bail funds and harshly limiting how they can help people who are incarcerated.
The bill adds 30 additional charges that are ineligible for unsecured judicial releases, popularly known as signature bonds. This list includes charges commonly associated with protesting, like unlawful assembly and obstruction of a law enforcement officer, and street racing, like reckless stunt driving and promoting drag races. Additionally, the bill only allows elected and appointed judges to set bonds in Georgia. Currently unelected and unappointed judges may serve in vacant positions to help courts provide speedier bond hearings. No more than 3 cash bonds may be posted per year by any individual, corporation, organization, charity, nonprofit corporation, or group in any jurisdiction, the bill now reads. This change will severely impact the operational ability of bail funds in the state of Georgia, like the Atlanta Solidarity Fund. To continue paying bail for arrested individuals, Georgia bail funds will need to register as professional bail bondsmen with the respective sheriffs in each county they intend to operate, which requires fingerprinting and a full background check conducted by the respective sheriffs and the FBI. Registered bail bondsman organizations are still unable to pay more than 3 cash bonds per year. They must instead go to a third-party company to attain a surety bond. Existing Georgia law also prohibits professional bondsmen from recommending defense attorneys to clients seeking bond. Pairing defendants with attorneys is another common function of the Atlanta Solidarity Fund. Violating this provision will constitute a misdemeanor in Georgia. Atlanta Community Press Collective.
I find it relevant to note that it seems hypocritical to claim the training facility is needed to uphold the rule of law, and then go on to prosecute activists on flagrant, unprovable charges, but then deny blatant violations of the Clean Water Act and rule against the SRWA because they haven't submitted sufficient evidence of irreparable harm, especially when the state disabled one of the few measures in place to keep track of that information. In June of 2023, a petition for a referendum on the continuation of the Atlanta Police Training Facility begins, and they are given 60 days to meet the required number of signatures. It receives 116,000 of the needed 70,000 by September, but the state then claims that activists missed the deadline, even though the time limit was reset due to legal challenges to the original petition being limited to Atlanta residents only. The city has refused to count the petitions until it receives a federal opinion on the ruling, expanding valid signatures to DeKalb County residents, and on top of that also implemented signature matching, a process by which the state matches signatures provided to their records of people to ensure they are legitimate. But this is a flawed and extremely tedious process. It also arguably discriminates against non-English and New English speakers, as well as disabled people, and is a tactic historically used as a form of voter suppression. At the time of writing, this vote is still being delayed, with the city likely hoping that the project can get further along while time passes. The referendum is only the most recent in a collection of non-violent legal means of peaceful protest and dissent that Atlanta residents have turned to, and the response to it once again shows why many have felt the need to turn to direct action. In December of last year, the state also attempted and failed to implement a mask ban, claiming it was in the name of stopping crime and public safety. Many residents rightly pointed out that it was a blatant attempt at criminalizing resistance to mass surveillance and repression of protesters.
Laws intended to target white supremacist violence, like the Georgia anti-masking statute, have also been used against activists on the left. Georgia's domestic terrorism statute was expanded in 2017 after Dylann Roof killed 9 black churchgoers and injured 1 in an act of white supremacist violence. Over the last year, Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr has charged 42 individuals alleged to be associated with Cop City protests under the Georgia Domestic Terrorism Statute. The proposed city ordinance also targets commonly worn items, barrier face coverings like bandanas and hoods, typically forming part of a coat or sweatshirt. The state statute does not have this level of specificity, a key difference according to Hamilton. While both the state statute and Atlanta's proposed ordinance prohibit wearing hoods in public, the historical context of the state law is important, said Hamilton. The state anti-mask law, passed in 1951, doesn't define what it means by hood, but it was enacted with the express purpose to curb intimidation by people wearing KKK clothing in public. The headpiece worn by the Klan is, of course, called a hood, and in light of the statute's history, a reasonable reading of the 1951 law contemplates prohibiting wearing KKK hoods in public. On the other hand, Hood, as defined in Atlanta's proposed ordinance, refers to the fabric forming part of a coat or sweatshirt. The proposed ordinance makes clear in no uncertain terms that it intends to criminalize the innocent act of wearing a hoodie in public. Another key difference is the lack of intent requirement in the proposed city ordinance. Without an intent requirement, Hamilton expanded, people can be found to violate the statute whether they intend to conceal their identity or not. Not only does the lack of an intent requirement give the police wide latitude of who they can arrest for violating the ordinance, it is especially problematic in light of the numerous ways someone can be subjected to the law: wearing a gaiter to protect against the cold weather, or wearing a burqa or other head covering for religious expression, to name just two examples. Matt Scott, Atlanta Community Press Collective.
What these constant authoritarian fascist moves from the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta reveal is that the facility is not in the public interest. The use of flagrant RICO charges over Venmo transactions, domestic terrorism charges with no proof other than mud and phone numbers, the blatant voter suppression and dismantling of bail fund activism that has been normal since the civil rights movement. These things reveal to us that Cop City is about control. If democracy and the will of the people does not align with the Atlanta Police Foundation and its corporate backers, they will break democratic systems and their norms to force their decisions onto us. They will ban the most basic, lackluster safety measures against the pandemic, intentionally allowing its citizens to be exposed to multiple building pandemics and public health issues simply to more effectively surveil people in their political self-expression. Cop City is a backlash from the state and corporations backing APF and helping it pay for this project, a response to rising waves of public dissent. It is a direct response to the 2020 uprisings and solely exists to aid the state in making sure that it never happens again. It is also arguably at the epicenter of a renewed green scare. The escalations taking place over the last 40 or so years against environmental activists have reached their full culmination here, as with the Shack and Operation Backfire cases. The use of terrorism claims to justify harsh persecution, surveillance, and violence against environmentalists is essential to the state's strategy. Unable to actually prosecute anyone with hard evidence, they resort to hitting anyone possible with scary-sounding charges for mere associations or proximity to actions and individuals, hoping it will encourage them to snitch on each other and repress the entire movement's activity as people stay off the streets, fearing repression. The goal is not a rule of law in any meaningful sense, but merely to rule over people. I want to especially zoom in on the use of the word terrorist here. I think it's fair to say that the way the term is often used in American politics is incredibly dishonest. At times, it feels as if the term functions as a political tool that silences the discussion on actual methods and motivations behind certain groups, creates fear-mongering, and discourages further conversations for fear of being labeled a sympathizer. It is a very McCarthyist tactic, inspired by the Red Scare, but taking on a new form. It is a term invoked to justify colonialism in the name of fighting terrorism, hiding U.S. culpability in creating said groups in the first place, and their links to American imperialism, or to justify wanton violence, increased militarization, and police surveillance. Who gets labeled a terrorist is incredibly selective. When Israeli soldiers intentionally bomb hospitals, schools, and refugee camps, they are not called terrorists, even though their actions fit the definition. Actions of violence targeting civilians designed to cause fear, chaos, and intimidation in furtherance of a political goal. Bombing aid convoys and UN workers and allowing them to be attacked by settlers in order to discourage further aid or legal challenges against Israel is textbook terrorism, yet it is not Israel's blatant settler colonial genocide that gets labeled terrorist by the international community. The movement to defend the forest has not killed a single individual. All of the bloodshed in this fight has been caused by the APD and Georgia state troopers, who have killed protesters with their hands in the air, harassed and intimidated community members for their association with this movement. By all means, APD is arguably the only dangerous terrorist organization operating in Atlanta, especially when they kill Atlantans with impunity. The broad use of terrorism claims to declare anyone in proximity to the movement a terrorist is also a case of Foucault's boomerang. This is a phenomenon pointed out by French philosopher Michel Foucault, where the tools and techniques of colonial rule in the periphery and Third World eventually return home to be used on the colonial nation's own populations. In the case of APD and its use of the term terrorist to justify unchecked violence and surveillance against civilian non-combatants, if we have to use that terminology, was learned directly from Israeli and American forces' policies and conductions of war overseas. The US has for a long time considered any military-age males, meaning young men over the age 16, as legitimate targets regardless of their actual participation in conflict. Shaky ground to stand on when it often relies on assumptions based on the target's appearance and behavior.
One former official told the New York Times that the emphasis on guilt by association had distorted collateral damage counts. They stated, "It bothers me when they say there were 7 guys, so they must be all militants. They count the corpses and they're not really sure who they are." In signature strikes, the precise identities of drone targets are not known. In these strikes, intelligence officials use the category of military-age males to both target individuals and assess collateral damage afterwards. This creates an almost self-fulfilling prophecy as these same assumptions about militarized masculinities become reproduced. Within this loop, there is little space for intelligence officials to actually interrogate whether men killed by drone strikes are indeed combatants or civilians. This lack of transparency means that journalists and analysts who have tried to count civilian deaths from US drone strikes have often produced divergent figures. In 2016, the US admitted their civilian casualty count from 2009 to 2015 in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya was between 64 and 116. In contrast, TBIJ estimated that civilian deaths are as many as 6 times higher than this, between 380 to 801 civilians. Overall, the US counted 2,436 dead persons, including civilians, and TBIJ counted 2,753 in total. But TBIJ did not use military-aged males as an analytic category. Their methodology, therefore, does not suppose a presumptive link between masculinity and militancy. And so, by rejecting military-aged males as a presumptive category, it produces a very different casualty count, suggesting that dozens of young male civilians are being killed by US drones. Military-aged males in US drone strikes, AOAV.
In America, many protesters who act in a street medic capacity no longer wear patches or any outward symbols that denote them as medics. This is because in 2020, police would frequently target such people with the most intense police violence. Medics were often the first people targeted when police began shooting at protesters or attacking them. Despite being technically a war crime, as is the use of tear gas, police targeted protesters whose roles included medic capacities, evacuation, or other similar support roles. On top of this, they would frequently target these people so that even if unable to arrest, they could destroy or otherwise confiscate vital medical supplies. This is part of why the state of Georgia is targeting bail funds with police violence and repressive legislation. Their role in the movement is seen as logistically vital, and though they have committed no crime and have not acted out of any established norms, they must be targeted for aiding terrorists and criminals. Such conditions reveal the naked truth. Whether the term being used is terrorist or thug or gang affiliate or illegal immigrant or criminal or any other similar term, these words exist to demonize the just and legitimate struggle of the colonized world, to flatten and make terrifying all forms of struggle, no matter how nonviolent or respectable, be it for the environment, against colonialism, fascism, or genocide. If your actions benefit the state, you can never be a terrorist. If they do not, no matter how peaceful and justified you are a terrorist. To the US, the Palestinians who marched peacefully during the March of Return, indigenous people who fought to protect their sovereignty, black people who marched for their rights and exercised their right to armed self-defense, eco-activists who never harmed a single human body and only liberated abused animals and protected the environment, migrants who fled violence caused by the US and sought legal political asylum. All of these groups are dangerous hordes of thugs and criminals. Terrorists. They call us war criminals even as we are victimized by war crimes, accuse us of terrorism, even as they terrorize the innocent. Cop City is only the tip of an iceberg of repression we are now set to experience. As we speak, multiple similar projects are being planned across the country, all with the same goal of further training cops to repress and criminalize protest and action. Projects have begun or been built already in more than 12 states across the US, including Baltimore, Honolulu, Florida, Colorado Springs, San Pablo, Knoxville, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Lansing, Chicago, New Jersey, and Texas. Cop City is the US's plan for climate change. It is American climate policy, continuing extraction and ecocide, while criminalizing or neutering resistance in any form. The proliferation of new critical infrastructure laws further allows the state to officially legislate away basic forms of resistance. Since the Standing Rock Dakota Access Pipeline protests, over 19 critical infrastructure laws have been introduced, specifically to criminalize the methods utilized by that and similar movements, as well as legalize vigilante violence against protesters. Louisiana and Florida stand as prime examples of these laws. Protesters in Louisiana face similarly flagrant charges as Cop City participants for even less crimes. Even as Louisiana is labeled Cancer Alley, due to the extreme proliferation of corporate, toxic waste and pollution.
Such laws have proliferated across the country in the last 5 years and are now on the books in 19 states due to the efforts of the conservative legislators organization known as the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, and the meticulous lobbying of powerful oil and gas companies. ALEC may have provided the language, but the country's biggest oil and gas manufacturers and associations have worked behind the scenes to get state lawmakers across the country on board with critical infrastructure laws. The tip of the spear is really the AFPM, Gibson said, the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers, a powerful trade organization that represents companies such as Koch Industries, Chevron Corporation, and ExxonMobil, among others. A weapon by the state to silence our voices, Piper French.
Clearly, the Green Scare didn't end in the 2010s. Just as the government repressed eco-activists and labeled them terrorists, the same year climate change was proven to be real, they will continue repression even as climate change becomes our sole reality. The state is not invested in our salvation. We are part of the burning earth they profit from.
Swimming in the ocean, I'm surfing in the waves. Sand is hitting my salty cheeks, but I don't seem to care. Fish are in the ocean, the whale seems to be out.
Whether terrorists or freedom fighters, Earth First says it will continue this summer's campaign of conservation through confrontation, attempting to save the wilderness and man from himself, vowing to live up to its motto, no compromise in the defense of Mother Earth. Ken Kashiwahara, ABC News in Southern Oregon.
The struggle against climate collapse has advanced beyond what most would guess. We are no longer living in the era of preventing collapse. We are living through it. In a future where people struggle to protect what is left of nature and survive collapse, continued repression is inevitable. There is a clear effort from the state to criminalize any form of resistance whatsoever. Yet, like so many colonized before, the choice to resist has been taken, and thus we have no choice but to struggle regardless. Those who fought before us are still alive, still fighting now, and still inspiring others to follow them. Paul Watson, the founder of the Sea Shepherds, still works in conservation and performs direct action to stop whale poachers to this day. He was arrested last week at time of writing, on July 22nd by Danish police, and I'll provide a link to both his organization and his petition to free him. Rod Coronado is also still an active conservationist by legal means, and founded an organization called Wolf Patrol, which fights wolf poaching and advocates for the animals and their habitats. His organization will also be linked below, and both websites have sections dedicated to helping newcomers get involved should you choose. Multiple struggles continue to be fought in the US as we speak. In Appalachia, a pipeline stretching between the Virginias, owned by the Mountain Valley Pipeline Company, has just been completed and begun pumping oil over 300 miles across states. Built on land prone to mudslides, the project was revived in 2022 by Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. The fight against it took place over the course of several years and involved tireless efforts of nonviolent direct action from locals. The environmental impact has already been devastating, with local streams suffering from pollution and runoff damage, with 3.5 miles of the pipeline cutting through the Jefferson National Forest. The pipeline also poses an explosion risk, and previous pipelines built on similar terrain have twice exploded within the last decade. With heat waves becoming more frequent and more intense over the years, this also drastically increases the risk of forest fires. In Hawaii, the US Navy, the biggest polluter in the world, spilled thousands of gallons of jet fuel into one of Oahu's few sources of fresh water for the population, poisoning 6,000 people in 2021 and 2022. The damage continues, as this year the Red Hill Community Representation Initiative detected high levels of PFAS, forever chemicals, in the water, making it unsafe to drink. Yet while they were warning people not to drink the water, the Navy claimed there was no issue at hand. More in line with the government's refusal to actually prevent or solve environmental crises, just last week at time of writing, the Supreme Court repealed a 1984 decision known as the Chevron deference. This decision essentially allowed federal regulatory agencies to have sway over the rulings of judges in cases that involve their jurisdiction. the court consigned to history a 1984 ruling called Chevron v. Natural Resources Defense Council. That decision had said judges should defer to federal agencies in interpreting the law when the language of a statute is ambiguous, thereby giving regulatory flexibility to bureaucrats. What little regulations that protected people from corporate greed and malicious incompetence regarding the environment's health existed in the first place are being stripped away or destroyed. The right to peaceful protest and resistance may be taken away, but it does not change the necessity of direct action and disruption to ecocide anyway. That can mean fostering community gardens, guerrilla gardening indigenous plants and wildlife, managing our local wild spaces on our own, or other forms of autonomous action. It must also mean disrupting and actively fighting the destruction, even if our legal means are unjustly legislated away. Part of the question then is, how will activists protect themselves and the right to demonstration and to nonviolent disruption targeted at the material machinations of ecocide? Answering this requires learning lessons from the previous Green Scares and how past movements adapted to repression. The zine Green Scared is also primarily focused on this topic and offers several useful points. For one, the anonymous author emphasizes heavily the importance of solidarity during times of repression. In the case of Operation Bite Back and the Shack 7, the bigger threats to activists were each other's disloyalties rather than prison time. In many cases, prosecution's victory in a case seemed unlikely until people got scared and began to talk. Police often intentionally lie to and intimidate incarcerated people in order to force or manipulate confessions, and giving in to these coercions didn't actually mean lessened sentences. In fact, in many cases it meant scared people admitting things they never did under duress. This is a tactic frequently used to hide the state's hand that they have a weak case they know they can't win. But if you're a 19-year-old activist getting hit with a DT charge or something similar, carrying years of jail time, it can be incredibly easy to take that deal and roll on comrades. The Green Scare cases show that cooperating with the government is never in a defendant's best interest. On average, the non-cooperating defendants in Operation Backfire are actually serving less time in proportion to their original threatened sentences than the informants, despite the government engaging the entire repressive apparatus of the United States to make an example of them. Exile and Sadie were threatened with over 1,000 years in prison apiece, and are serving less than 8. If every arrestee understood the difference between what the state threatens and what it can actually do, far fewer would give up without a fight. In the United States legal system, a court case is essentially a game of chicken. The state starts by threatening the worst penalties it possibly can, in hope of intimidating the defendant into pleading guilty and informing. It is easier if the defendant pleads guilty immediately. This saves the state immense quantities of time and money, not to mention the potential embarrassment of losing a well-publicized trial. Defendants should not be intimidated by the initial charges brought against them. It often turns out that many of these will not hold up, and are only being pressed to give the state more bargaining power. Even if a defendant fears he won't have a leg to stand on in court, he can obtain some bargaining power of his own by threatening to put the state through a costly, challenging, and unpredictable trial. To that end, it is essential to acquire the best possible legal representation. When a defendant agrees to cooperate, he loses all that leverage, throwing himself at the mercy of forces that don't have an ounce of mercy to offer. No matter how hopeless things look, never underestimate the power of fighting it out. To this end, jail support networks are extremely vital to preventing these kinds of abuses. People experiencing political repression need community to close ranks around them, so that the kind of social and financial pressure the state places people under in order to abuse innocent people cannot be effective. Security culture and other ways of avoiding repression and arrest are extremely important, and they will be discussed, but ultimately these things can only protect you so much. A focus on individual security culture will never be enough. A strong community can support the repressed. A strong community is less likely to turn informant, and a strong community is much harder to repress. The author's intent with this zine was not to encourage a snitches get stitches attitude. That way of thinking and the coercion to silence it breeds is not going to help anyone, nor will the violence it takes to enforce. Instead, they remain focused on developing and defending the security culture of a movement. A community is only as secure in the sense of facing repression as its least secure member. Security culture is an incredibly basic but vital concept. It's essentially how a community of activists, protesters, etc. establish knowledge and procedures to prevent surveillance and targeting from police. This is incredibly important because, as we've acknowledged in this video, the state will take serious measures to surveil, disrupt, infiltrate, and harm members of political movements antithetical to capital. Security culture protects against this. Security culture is at its most basic about information. Who has access to it, who needs to know what, and these sorts of things. People within a community of activists should never be sharing critical information on actions, who did what at an action, or future plans with anyone who doesn't need to know and isn't trusted. If they aren't trusted, they don't need to know. If they don't need to know, it doesn't matter that they're trusted. Don't tell them. Organizations such as the Electronic Freedom Frontier, Stop LAPD Spying, the ACLU, and the Ruckus Society, as well as CrimeThink, all provide more detailed information than I will for the purposes of this video, as well as online privacy guides and zines on security culture. The EEF specifically has a really good guide on surveillance self-defense that I'll link. I also recommend both Green Scared and Sprout Distro's Security Culture zine as required reading after this video. If you are ever visited by federal agents for any reason, you should record the interactions and refuse to answer their questions. Your comrades and any people you organize with should also immediately be notified. Another zine I can link is one I did a reading of titled If an Agent Knocks. These are only some very basic points about security, as this isn't the video for that necessarily. I leave you with the urge and plea to continue the struggle for our planet and for liberation. Repression is as old as politics, but that doesn't mean we can't beat it, and it certainly doesn't mean that we cease to fight.
Strip mining mountains by the ton, digging up the uranium. Bald eagle looking for a place to land, when it's all gone for nuclear plants. Must we poison the water, earth, and air just to cook a piece of toast or blow dry our hair? In defense of Mother